They say the most profound moments in life come when we least expect them. For Jake McCall, it happened on that stormy night when he heard desperate screams cutting through the thundering rain. Without hesitation, he mounted his horse and rode hard toward Miller's Creek, where he found Sarah Bennett, 8 months pregnant and trapped in her sinking wagon as the floodwaters rose. In that moment, his lonely life as a struggling rancher changed forever. He managed to get her to safety, giving her shelter in his modest home. But in a town where appearances matter more than truth, their arrangement sparked a scandal that would force both of them to make an impossible choice: marry a stranger or leave behind everything they'd ever known. Neither could have predicted how fate would use their forced union to heal two broken souls. But can a marriage built on necessity truly blossom into love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Montana sky in whispers of pink and gold as Jake McCall's weathered boots crunched across the frost-covered ground. His morning routine hadn't changed in 15 years, not since his father's passing left him sole owner of the struggling McCall ranch. He pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest, its hands forever frozen at 6:42, the moment Thomas McCall's heart had given out in the north pasture. Jake ran his thumb over its scratched surface before tucking it away, a ritual as familiar as breathing. The barn door creaked open, greeting him with the warm scent of hay and leather. His mare, Shadow, nickered softly at his approach. "Morning, old girl," he murmured, reaching for the curry brush. The repetitive strokes across Shadow's dark coat centered him, as they had through countless mornings of solitude. Through the barn's open door, he could see the bank's foreclosure notice still tacked to his fence post, fluttering like a white flag of surrender in the morning breeze. 3 months to come up with the back payments, or the land his grandfather had homesteaded would go to auction. The thought sat in his gut like a stone. Jake had tried everything, taking odd jobs in town, selling off the prize bulls, even attempting to lease the north pasture. But drought had hit hard these past 2 years, and few wanted to risk their livestock on land that barely sustained his own reduced herd. In town, they whispered about the McCall curse, how Thomas's widow had run off with a traveling salesman 6 months after the funeral, leaving 12-year-old Jake to be raised by his father's sister until she too passed on 5 years later. How the once prosperous ranch had dwindled under Jake's care, despite his dawn-to-dusk labor. What they didn't whisper about was how Jake had given up his dreams of veterinary school to keep the ranch running, how he'd nursed every sick calf through bitter winter nights, or how he still maintained the books with the same precise penmanship his father had taught him, recording every penny spent and earned in leather-bound ledgers. Shadow bumped his shoulder gently, drawing him back to the present. He needed to check the creek's water level after last night's storm. Spring floods were common in these parts, and the melting snow from the mountains had already swollen the waterways beyond their usual bounds. He saddled Shadow with practiced ease, each buckle and strap falling perfectly into place. His father had taught him early that a cowboy's relationship with his horse could mean the difference between life and death out here, where help was often hours away. The morning air bit through his denim jacket as they rode out, Shadow's hooves leaving deep prints in the mud. The ranch spread out before them, 800 acres of Montana wilderness that had been in the McCall family for 3 generations. To the east, the snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains scraped the sky. To the west, Miller's Creek wound through the valley like a silver ribbon, marking the boundary of his property. Jake paused at the ridge overlooking his southern pasture. The grass was starting to green up, though it was still too early to move the cattle down from their winter grazing. A few more weeks of spring rains, and maybe, just maybe, he'd have enough hay to sell come summer. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all he had. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention. Frank Miller, his nearest neighbor, appeared on his paint stallion. "Morning, Jake," Frank called, reining in beside him. Some storm last night. Morning, Frank. Jake nodded, noting the concern in the older man's eyes. Frank had been his father's friend, and he'd tried to look out for Jake over the years in his own gruff way. Heard about the bank notice, Frank said quietly. Martha and I might be able to help out with a small loan. I appreciate it, Frank. Jake cut him off gently. But I can't take your money. The McCalls have always handled their own troubles. Frank's weathered face creased with worry. Pride's all well and good, son, but it won't save the ranch. Have you considered selling off the east parcel? Henderson's boy might be interested. Jake's jaw tightened. This land stays together, Frank. It's what Pa would have wanted. The older man sighed, knowing better than to argue. Well, if you change your mind. He touched his hat brim and turned his horse toward home, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts and the vast Montana sky. The morning wore on, as Jake rode his fence line, mending breaks from the storm and checking on his scattered herd. Each cow represented a small fortune in potential calves and meat. But it wasn't enough. The numbers in his ledger kept flashing. Through his mind, mortgage payments, feed costs, equipment repairs. The math never added up, no matter how he figured it. By noon, dark clouds were gathering again over the mountains. Jake turned shadow toward home, his mind already on the list of chores waiting at the ranch house. The old place needed work. The roof leaked in 3 places. The porch steps were rotting, and the paint was peeling from the clappered siding. But repairs took money he didn't have, so he made do with patches and prayers. Inside, the house was as neat as his mother had kept it, though the furniture was worn and faded. Jake had never seen the point in replacing things that still served their purpose. His boots echoed on the wooden floors as he moved through the empty rooms, checking windows against the approaching storm. In the kitchen, he warmed up yesterday's coffee and made a simple sandwich. The silence pressed in around him as he ate. At the scarred oak table, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Sometimes, in moments like these, the loneliness felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. But Jake had learned long ago that a man couldn't rely on anything but himself and the land beneath his feet. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, Jake returned to the barn to check on his stock. Shadow wickered a greeting, and he took comfort in the familiar sounds and smells of the animals. Here, at least, was something he understood. The simple truth of caring for creatures that depended on him. The storm gathered force as evening approached, drumming against the barn's metal roof. Jake had just finished his evening chores when he heard it, a cry carrying faintly over the wind and rain, a sound that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. He paused, head cocked, listening intently. There it was again, unmistakably. Human this time, coming from the direction of Miller's Creek. Earlier that fateful day, Sarah Bennett had stood at her husband's grave one last time, her fingers tracing the rough edges of his headstone. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she whispered, her other hand resting on her swollen belly. "But I have to think of the baby now." The Kansas cemetery was already growing wild with spring flowers, nature claiming back the earth where they'd laid him just 5 months ago. The unfinished baby blanket in her carpet bag weighed heavily on her mind. She'd started it the day she told Thomas about the pregnancy, his face lighting up with a joy that made her heart ache to remember. Now it lay half done, the delicate stitches a testament to dreams interrupted. She couldn't bear to work on it after the mining accident, but she couldn't leave it behind either. Her wedding ring caught the morning light as she adjusted her shawl. The simple gold band represented everything she'd lost: security, love, the future they'd planned together. But the ring also reminded her of Thomas's last words. "Promise me you'll find happiness again, Sarah. Promise me you won't let grief steal your life away." The journey to California seemed the only answer. Her sister Mary's letters painted pictures of orange groves and endless sunshine, of a place where a widow with a child might start fresh without the weight of whispered sympathy and pitying glances. The money from selling their small house would be enough to get her there, with a little left over to start anew. The wagon she'd purchased was sturdy, if not new, loaded with the carefully chosen remnants of her old life. Quilts her mother had, made Thomas's books, the china tea set that had been her grandmother's wedding gift. Each item wrapped in memories as much as in newspaper and cloth. The first few days on the trail had been the hardest. Every creak of the wagon, every unfamiliar sound in the night made her heart race. But gradually, she found a rhythm to the journey. Wake before dawn, check the horses, eat a simple breakfast, and drive until the heat of the day forced her to rest. She'd learned to harness and unhitch by herself, though the growing weight of the baby made every task more challenging. At night, alone in her wagon, Sarah would often take out her journal and write to Thomas, telling him about the day's travels, her hopes, her fears. "I felt the baby kick today," she wrote one evening, "strong like you were. I wonder if it's a boy with your determined spirit." The pages grew damp with tears she couldn't quite hold back. The further west she traveled, the more the landscape changed. The familiar Kansas plains gave way to rolling hills, then the harsh beauty of the Montana Territory. The spring weather was unpredictable, switching from warm sunshine to bitter cold with little warning. But Sarah pressed on, one hand often, resting on her belly as if drawing strength from the little life within. She'd been making good time, following the well-marked trail toward the next town when the storm began to gather. At first it seemed manageable, just another spring shower to wait out. She'd pulled her oilcloth tight over the wagon's canvas top and urged her horses forward, hoping to reach shelter before the worst hit. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the wagon cover like 1,000 impatient fingers. Lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled across the valley with such force it made her teeth rattle. The horses grew skittish, fighting against the reins as the wind whipped their manes. Sarah spotted Miller's Creek ahead, usually a gentle stream, but now swollen with spring runoff and rain. The crossing had looked safe enough on her map, marked as a common ford for wagons, but in the growing darkness and rain, she could barely make out the trail markers. A sudden gust of wind caught the wagon's cover, throwing it back like a sail. Sarah struggled to control both the horses and the flapping canvas as rain soaked through her clothes. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and she saw with horror that the creek had burst its banks, water rushing across the ford with frightening speed. She tried to turn the team around, but the soft ground at the creek's edge had turned to mud. The wagon wheels slipped, then sank. The horses panicked, their hooves churning uselessly in the muck. Sarah felt the wagon begin to tilt as the current caught it, slowly at first, then with increasing force. "Help!" she screamed into the howling wind, knowing it was futile. There couldn't be anyone close enough to hear, not in this weather, not in this wilderness. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her fear, and she wrapped her arms protectively around her middle. Water began seeping through the wagon bed as it settled deeper into the mud. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could try to reach the horses, cut them free perhaps, but one wrong step in this current could be fatal. The bank wasn't far, but with her advanced pregnancy, she doubted she could swim against the flow. Thomas's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "Stay calm, love. Help will come." She'd always teased him about his unshakable optimism, but now she clung to it like a lifeline. She had to survive, for the baby, for the future she'd promised Thomas she'd build. Lightning illuminated the scene again, and through the curtain of rain, Sarah caught a glimpse of something moving on the ridge above the creek, a horse and rider, or a trick of the light. She screamed again, pouring all her remaining strength into the sound. The wagon shuddered as another surge of water hit it. Sarah braced herself against the seat, one hand gripping the wooden frame, the other pressed against her belly. The baby kicked again, strong and insistent. "Hold on, little one," she whispered. "Just hold on." Then she heard it, the splash of hooves in water, the grunt of a horse under strain. Through the rain and darkness came a voice, deep and steady. "Take my hand, ma'am. I've got you." Jake's strong arms lifted Sarah from the sinking wagon with surprising gentleness, settling her before him on his horse. She clutched at the saddle horn, shivering violently as the rain continued to pour. Behind them, the wagon groaned as the current pulled it deeper into the churning waters. "My things!" Sarah gasped, thinking of the baby blanket, Thomas's books, all the precious memories she'd carried with her. "Please, there's a Bible at least, my family Bible." Jake hesitated only a moment before guiding his horse closer to the wagon. Keeping one arm firmly around Sarah, he reached into the back of the wagon, fingers finding purchase on a leather-bound book. The current nearly pulled it from his grasp, but he managed to secure it inside his coat. "Hold tight," he instructed, turning the horse toward higher ground. Sarah pressed back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart even through her panic. The horse picked its way carefully through the floodwaters, each step measured and sure, despite the treacherous conditions. The journey to Jake's ranch house seemed endless through the driving rain. By the time they reached the porch, Sarah was barely conscious, her sodden dress weighing her down like armor. Jake dismounted first, then lifted her down with the same careful strength he'd shown at the creek. "Can you stand?" he asked, keeping his hands at her waist until she nodded. "Let's get you inside before that baby of yours decides to make an early appearance." The house was dark and cool, smelling of wood smoke and coffee. Jake struck a match, lighting a kerosene lamp that cast warm shadows across the room. Sarah stood dripping on the plank floor, arms wrapped protectively around her middle, taking in the sparse but tidy furnishings. "Wait here," Jake said, disappearing down a hallway. He returned moments later with a stack of towels and what looked like men's clothing. "These were my aunt's rooms," he explained, leading her to a door off the main room. "Bathroom's through there. Get yourself dried off and changed. I'll make some hot tea." Sarah found herself in a bedroom that, despite its obvious disuse, still held a feminine touch in its flowered wallpaper and crocheted coverlet. The clothes Jake had brought were simple, a man's flannel shirt and wool trousers with suspenders, but they were dry. She changed quickly, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs to make them fit her smaller frame. When she emerged, Jake had a fire going in the stone hearth and a pot of tea steeping on the kitchen table. He'd changed as well, his wet clothes replaced by dry denims and a clean shirt. He looked younger in the firelight, though worry still creased his brow as he studied her. "The baby?" he asked, pulling out a chair for her. "Settling down now," Sarah assured him, accepting the cup of tea he offered. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened if—" Her voice caught, and she busied herself with the tea to hide sudden tears. Jake sat across from her, his own cup untouched. "No need for thanks. Couldn't leave you out there." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You're welcome to stay until the weather clears, and we can see about retrieving your wagon, though I suspect there won't be much left to salvage." Sarah's hands tightened around her cup. "I don't want to impose—" "No imposition," Jake cut in firmly. "Storm's likely to last through the night anyway. No sense in you trying to make other arrangements now." As if to emphasize his point, thunder crashed overhead, making the windows rattle. Sarah jumped slightly, and Jake's expression softened. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Get some rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." He showed her, back to the bedroom, explaining about the chamber pot under the bed and extra blankets in the chest. "I'm just down the hall if you need anything," he added, hand resting briefly on the doorframe. "Sleep well, Mrs. Bennett," she supplied. "Sarah Bennett, Jake McCall," he responded with a slight nod. "Good night, Mrs. Bennett." Left alone, Sarah sank onto the bed, physical and emotional exhaustion finally overtaking her. The baby stirred restlessly, and she rubbed her belly in soothing circles. "We're okay," she whispered. "We're okay." Her gaze fell on the family Bible, which Jake had placed on the bedside table. The leather was water-stained, but intact. She opened it carefully, finding the family records page still legible. There was Thomas's name, their wedding date written in her careful hand, and below it, a blank space where their child's name would go. Tears fell freely now as she traced the familiar words. Through the wall, she could hear Jake moving about the house, his footsteps solid and reassuring. There was something comforting about his quiet presence, his unquestioning offer of shelter. In her experience, men who lived alone were often rough, uncertain around women. But Jake seemed to know exactly what she needed: space, warmth, safety. She slept fitfully, waking several times to the sound of rain and thunder. Each time she could hear Jake still moving around the house, checking windows, adding wood to the fire, his boots soft on the wooden floors. It should have made her nervous, being alone in a strange man's house, but instead she found herself oddly comforted by his vigilance. Dawn brought weak sunlight and the sound of roosters crowing. Sarah dressed in her now dry clothes, grateful to find them laid out by the fire. In the kitchen, she found Jake already up, coffee brewing on the wood stove. "Morning," he greeted her, pouring a cup. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she admitted, accepting the coffee. "Though I'm not sure what I'm going to do now." The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. All her careful plans, her savings, her possessions, gone in one night of storm and flood. Jake set a plate of eggs and toast before her. "Eat first," he said firmly. "Then we'll ride out and see what's left of your wagon. Miller's boy told me the creek's already going down." Sarah looked up sharply. "Someone was here?" Jake nodded, something unreadable crossing his face. "Frank Miller rode by at first light to check on storm damage. He saw your wagon," he hesitated, "and he saw your things drying by my fire." Understanding dawned slowly. In a small town, such things would matter. A pregnant widow spending the night in a bachelor's home, regardless of the circumstances. "I've caused you trouble," she said, quietly. Jake's jaw tightened. "You've caused nothing. Eat your breakfast, Mrs. Bennett. We've got a long day ahead." But as Sarah watched him move about the kitchen, she could see the tension in his shoulders, hear the worry beneath his practical words. She'd lived in small towns long enough to know how quickly gossip could spread, how harshly judgment could fall. This man had saved her life, offered her shelter without question, and now his reputation would suffer for it. The baby kicked, a sharp reminder of all she had to consider. She wasn't just making decisions for herself anymore. She needed to think of her child, of their future. But in that moment, watching Jake's quiet strength as he went about his morning routine, she couldn't help but wonder if fate had brought her to this place for a reason. Word traveled fast in small towns, carried on whispers as swift as wind through prairie grass. By mid-morning, every soul in Cedar Ridge knew about Jake McCall's midnight rescue and his unusual houseguest. The Ladies' Aid Society had already convened an emergency meeting at Martha Miller's house, their concerns documented in careful script in the meeting minutes. Jake noticed the stairs as he rode into town with Sarah beside him in his wagon, headed to see what remained of her possessions. Old Mrs. Henderson actually crossed the street to avoid them, pulling her shawl tight as if scandal might be catching. Behind the mercantile's dusty windows, faces appeared and disappeared like anxious prairie dogs. "The First Bank of Cedar Ridge," Sarah read from the weathered sign, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Do you think they'll help?" Jake tied off the reins, then helped her down from the wagon. "Worth asking. You'll need money to replace what was lost." He didn't mention that this same bank was threatening to take his ranch. Some burdens weren't meant to be shared. The bank manager, Edwin Porter, was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a perpetual frown. He listened to Sarah's story with pressed lips, occasionally glancing at Jake as if trying to decode some hidden meaning in his presence. "I see," Porter said finally, shuffling papers on his desk. "And you have no male relatives who might co-sign for such a loan? A brother, perhaps, or an uncle?" Sarah's spine stiffened. "My husband's insurance money and the sale of our Kansas property were in that wagon, Mr. Porter. I'm not asking for charity, just a loan against funds I can prove existed. My dear Mrs. Bennett," Porter's voice dripped with false sympathy, "surely you understand our position. A woman in your condition, with no fixed address, no collateral." His eyes slid to Jake again. "Though perhaps Mr. McCall would be willing to voucher for you." Jake's hands clenched at his sides, but before he could speak, the bank's door opened. Reverend Matthews stepped in, his usual gentle expression replaced by something harder. "Jake, Mrs. Bennett, I wonder if I might have a word?" Outside, the spring sun had warmed the wooden sidewalk, but Sarah felt chilled to the bone. The Reverend led them to his office in the small white church, its spire reaching toward heaven like an accusing finger. "I understand the difficult position you both find yourself in," Reverend Matthews began, folding his hands on his desk. "But surely you must see how this appears to our community. A pregnant widow, living under the roof of an unmarried man." "She needed help," Jake cut in, his voice low but firm. "Would you have had me leave her to drown?" "Of course not," the Reverend sighed. "Your actions were admirable, Jake. But now, well, propriety must be considered. Mrs. Miller has offered to take Mrs. Bennett in." "I couldn't impose," Sarah interrupted quickly. "I have no means to pay for board, and in my condition—" "Then perhaps," the Reverend pressed, "other arrangements should be made. The widow's home in Millbrook, a poorhouse?" Jake's voice carried an edge Sarah hadn't heard before. "The woman's lost everything, Reverend. She's not looking for charity or judgment." A shadow crossed Reverend Matthews's face. "Then what exactly is she looking for, Jake? And what are your intentions?" The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, one hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. Jake's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a commotion erupted outside. Through the church window they could see a group of women approaching, led by Eugenia Whitaker, the self-appointed guardian of Cedar Ridge's moral standards. Her voice carried clearly through the spring air. "Well, I never, in all my years, living in sin right under our noses. And him, Thomas McCall's son, what would his poor mother say?" Sarah watched the color drain from Jake's face at the mention of his mother. Without thinking, she reached for his arm, feeling the tension thrumming through him like a plucked wire. "We should go," she whispered. "I've caused enough trouble." But Jake stood his ground as Eugenia burst into the Reverend's office, her face flushed with righteous indignation. Behind her, a cluster of town ladies pressed forward, armed with scripture, quotes and thinly veiled accusations. "Reverend Matthews, something must be done. Think of the example this sets for our young people. A man harboring a... Eugenia's eyes raked over Sarah's swollen belly. "Mrs. Whitaker," Jake's voice cut through the chatter like a knife through. "You butter? Mrs. Bennett is a guest in my home, nothing more. And I'd thank you to remember that my mother taught me to help those in need, regardless of what others might think." "Help?" Eugenia's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Is that what you call it? The whole town's talking, Jake McCall." "Your reputation—" "My reputation," Jake interrupted quietly, "is my own concern." But Sarah could see the toll this was taking on him. This man who had saved her life was now watching his standing in the community crumble because of that same act of kindness. The whispers would only grow louder, the judgment harsher, and with his ranch already in jeopardy. "I'll leave," she announced suddenly, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "Today, I can take the afternoon stage to Millbrook." "And go where?" Jake demanded, turning to her. "Do what? You're in no condition to travel, and you know it." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Sarah saw something in Jake's gaze that made her breath catch. Not pity or duty, but genuine concern. He wasn't just being kind. He actually cared what happened to her and her unborn child. The church door opened again, and Frank Miller stepped in, his weathered face grave. "Jake, Sarah, the town council's called an emergency meeting. They're asking for you both." Sarah felt her knees go weak. She'd seen town councils pass judgment before, had witnessed how quickly a community could turn against those who didn't fit their strict moral code. Beside her, Jake stood straight and tall, his father's pocket watch, catching the light as he helped her to her feet. "Whatever happens," he said softly, for her ears alone, "you're not alone in this." The words warmed something deep inside her, even as fear clutched at her heart. They stepped out into the spring sunshine together, the whispers following them. like shadows, neither knowing that the real storm was yet to come. The town hall's wooden benches had been worn smooth by generations of Cedar Ridge citizens, but they felt like instruments of torture as Sarah sat beside Jake, facing the assembled council. 5 stern faces looked down from the raised platform. Mayor Harrison, Reverend Matthews, Edwin Porter from the bank, Frank Miller, and old Dr. Wilson, who'd delivered most of the town's children over the past 40 years. Late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The room was packed with townspeople, their whispered conversations creating a constant rustle like dry leaves in the wind. Sarah could feel their stares boring into her back, could practically taste their judgment on the air. Mayor Harrison cleared his throat, shuffling the papers before him. This emergency session of the Cedar Ridge Town Council is now in session. His gavel struck wood with a sound like fate itself knocking. We're here to address the matter of unusual circumstances regarding Mr. Jake McCall and Mrs. Sarah Bennett. Jake's shoulder brushed against Sarah's, solid and reassuring. She wondered if he could hear her heart pounding, loud as summer thunder in her ears. Now then, the mayor continued, let's review the facts. 2 nights ago during the storm, Mr. McCall rescued Mrs. Bennett from Miller's Creek. She has since been residing at his ranch, unchaperoned, despite her condition and his unmarried status. Is this correct? Yes, sir. Jake's voice was steady. Though I'd add that Mrs. Bennett was nearly 8 months pregnant and had just lost everything she owned to the flood. I could hardly turn her out. No one's questioning your initial actions, Jake. Reverend Matthews leaned forward. It's the continued arrangement that concerns us. Surely you see how this appears? I see a woman in need of help, Jake replied. Nothing more. Edwin Porter adjusted his spectacles with precise movements. Perhaps we should hear from Mrs. Bennett herself. After all, her reputation is also at stake here. Sarah stood slowly, one hand supporting her back. I'm grateful for Mr. McCall's assistance. He's been nothing but a gentleman, and I've been trying to make other arrangements. Other arrangements? Eugenia Whitaker's voice cut through from the audience. Like what? The widow's home won't take her until after the baby's born, and no respectable family can take in a woman in her condition without causing talk. Mrs. Whitaker, Mayor Harrison warned, please remember this is a formal council meeting. But the damage was done. The whispers grew louder, and Sarah could catch fragments that made her cheeks burn, probably planning it all along. Poor Thomas McCall would be scandalized. Desperate woman, desperate times. Enough. Jake's voice cracked like a whip as he stood. If anyone has accusations to make them to my face. But leave Mrs. Bennett's character out of it. Dr. Wilson, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Jake's right about one thing. The lady's in no condition to be traveling. That baby's due within weeks, and spring storms make the roads treacherous. Frank Miller nodded slowly. And the bank's already said they won't extend her credit for lodging elsewhere. He shot a pointed look at Porter, who suddenly became very interested in his papers. Then we seemed to be at an impasse. Mayor Harrison sighed. Unless... The pause stretched like pulled taffy. Sarah felt the baby kick hard, as if sensing the tension in the room. Unless what? Jake asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew what was coming. There is one solution that would satisfy both propriety and practicality, Reverend Matthews said carefully. A solution that would protect both your reputations and provide Mrs. Bennett with the security she needs. Sarah's breath caught as understanding dawned. Beside her she felt Jake go very still. Marriage, the Reverend continued, a simple ceremony as soon as possible. It would legitimize the current living arrangement and ensure the child has a proper home. You can't be serious. Jake's voice was low, dangerous. You're suggesting we marry as some sort of social compromise? We're suggesting, Mayor Harrison cut in, that you do the honorable thing, Jake. Your father would have expected no less. The mention of Thomas McCall hit Jake like a physical blow. Sarah could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the muscle working in his jaw. "And if we refuse?" she asked, her voice smaller than she would have liked. Edwin Porter smiled thinly. "Then naturally, as upstanding citizens concerned with public morality, we would be forced to take action. The bank, for instance, might need to accelerate certain payment schedules. Jake's ranch. They were threatening Jake's ranch because of her. You have until Sunday," Mayor Harrison announced. "Either stand before Reverend Matthews and make this right, or leave Cedar Ridge, both of you. We won't have this kind of scandal in our town." The gavel fell again, hard and final. The meeting was over, but Sarah felt as if her world was just beginning to spin apart. Outside, the spring evening had turned cool, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was whirling with impossible choices. Jake stood beside her on the town hall. Steps, his face unreadable in the gathering dusk. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't—" "Don't," Jake cut her off gently. "You didn't ask for any of this. But your ranch, they'll take everything you've worked for, all because you helped me." Jake pulled out his father's pocket watch, studying it in the fading light. "Pa used to say a man's worth isn't in what he owns, but in what he does when doing right comes at a cost." "What are you saying?" He turned to face her, his eyes serious in the gathering darkness. "I'm saying we have a decision to make, Mrs. Bennett, and whatever we decide, we'll face it together." The baby kicked again, and Sarah pressed her hand to her side. A marriage of convenience, forced by circumstance and small-town morality. It wasn't what she'd dreamed of, wasn't what she'd planned. But then, neither was being a widow at 24 with a child on the way. "We hardly know each other," she said softly. "No," Jake agreed, "but we've got until Sunday to figure out if we can live with this choice. Will you come back to the ranch, just to talk things through?" Sarah looked at the darkening town around them, at the faces watching from windows and doorways, at the life she'd imagined slipping away like water through her fingers. Then she looked at Jake, this quiet, honorable man who'd risked everything to help a stranger. "Yes," she said finally. "Let's talk." Sunday morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of spring day that usually promised new beginnings. Sarah stood before the mirror in Jake's aunt's old room, smoothing the borrowed dress that Martha Miller had quietly delivered the day before. It was a simple blue cotton, hastily altered to accommodate her condition, but it was better than the travel-stained clothes she'd arrived in. The decision had come quietly, over cups of coffee and long talks by the fireplace. They discussed it like a business arrangement, practical considerations, clear boundaries, mutual expectations. Jake would keep his ranch, she would have a roof over her head, and a name to give her child. A marriage of convenience, nothing more. "We'll write it all down," Jake had said, practical as always. "Like a contract. Your space, my space, how we'll handle things after the baby comes. That way there's no confusion." Now Sarah pinned her hair back with trembling fingers, remembering Thomas's face on their wedding day 5 years ago. That had been a celebration of love, with flowers and music and dreams of forever. This was survival. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Dr. Wilson's wife Eleanor entered, carrying a small bouquet of early spring wildflowers. "I thought you might want these," she said softly. "Every bride should have flowers." Sarah's throat tightened at the simple kindness. "Thank you. You're doing the right thing," Eleanor added, helping her pin the flowers to her dress. "Jake McCall's a good man, maybe not as polished as some, but he has his father's heart." In the small church, the usual Sunday congregation had gathered, their faces a mix of judgment and curiosity. Jake stood at the altar with Frank Miller beside him as witness, his best shirt starched stiff, his father's watch chain gleaming against his vest. Sarah walked down the aisle alone, her steps measured, her head high. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her shame. This was a choice, maybe not one made freely, but a choice nonetheless. Reverend Matthews kept the ceremony brief, his words echoing in the hushed church. "Marriage," he intoned, "is a sacred covenant before." "Good, and these witnesses, a union of two hearts, two lives, bound together in holy matrimony. Sarah felt Jake's hand, warm and steady, as he slipped a plain gold band onto her finger. His mother's ring, he'd explained earlier, saved all these years in his father's desk. She noticed his slight start of surprise when she produced a ring. For him, Thomas's band, the only thing of value she'd had in her pocket when Jake pulled her from the flood. "I, Jake McCall, take thee Sarah Bennett." His voice was quiet but firm, making no mention of love but promising friendship, respect, and protection. Sarah repeated the traditional words, adding her own silent promises. To be useful, to make this work, to give his kindness the honor it deserved. "I now pronounce you man and wife." There was no kiss, just a gentle squeeze of hands before they turned to face the congregation. Sarah saw Eugenia Whittaker's pinched expression, Edwin Porter's calculating gaze, but also Eleanor Wilson's encouraging smile and Frank Miller's approving nod. The wedding breakfast was a simple affair in the church hall, organized by the Ladies' Aid Society more out of duty than celebration. Sarah picked at a piece of coffee cake, watching Jake accept congratulations with stoic grace. They were husband and wife now, bound by law and circumstance, but strangers still in all the ways that mattered. Later, as Jake helped her into the wagon for the ride home, she thought with a mix of wonder and trepidation, he paused. "I meant what I said in there," he told her quietly. "About friendship and respect. We'll make this work, Sarah, day by day." She nodded, touched by the sincerity in his voice. Day by day. The ranch house looked different as they approached. Though nothing had changed, Sarah felt the baby move and placed a hand on her belly, wondering what this child would make of the strange circumstances that had brought them here. Jake helped her down from the wagon, then surprised her by scooping her up before she could climb the porch steps. "Threshold," he explained with a hint of embarrassment. "My ma would come back to haunt me if I didn't do it proper." Sarah found herself laughing despite everything, and for a moment their eyes met in shared amusement. Then the moment passed, and reality settled back in. They were married but not married, together but separate, bound by paper and circumstance but not by heart. Yet as Jake set her down gently in what was now their home, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, fate had known what it was doing after all. The first week of their marriage settled into an awkward dance of careful courtesies and measured distances. They moved around each other like wary partners, learning unfamiliar steps, each trying not to intrude on the other's space while sharing the same small house. Sarah found Jake's mother's recipe book in the kitchen cabinet, its pages spotted with age and use. She ran her fingers over the handwritten notes in the margins. "Thomas loves these biscuits and Jake's favorite winter soup," feeling like an intruder in another woman's domain. Yet something about those domestic chronicles of love and care and called to her. One morning she decided to try the biscuit recipe, the kitchen filled with warm, yeasty scents as she worked, her movements slow but determined despite her ungainly condition. When Jake came in from his morning chores, he stopped short, an unreadable expression crossing his face. "Smells like Sunday mornings," he said quietly. "Ma used to—" "I hope you don't mind." Sarah gestured to the recipe book. "I thought maybe—" "No, I don't mind." He poured himself coffee, then hesitated before adding, "She would have liked that someone's using it again." They ate breakfast together, the biscuits turning out surprisingly well. Sarah watched Jake savor them, seeing the memories playing across his features. "These taste just like hers," he said finally, something soft in his voice that made her heart twist unexpectedly. The days developed a rhythm. Jake would rise before dawn, handling the heavy ranch work before the heat of the day. Sarah took over the cooking and household tasks, finding satisfaction in bringing order to the somewhat neglected house. They shared meals, exchanged polite conversation, and carefully maintained the boundaries they'd agreed upon. But small things began to shift, like spring ice breaking up on a river. Jake started bringing her wildflowers he found while checking. The fences, Sarah learned how he liked his coffee and had it ready when he came in from morning chores. They began sharing stories over supper, nothing too personal, just memories of places they'd been, people they'd known. One evening, Sarah was kneading bread dough when a sharp pain made her gasp. Jake was at her side instantly, his hand steady. "Under her elbow, the baby?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Just turning," she assured him, but didn't pull away from his support. "Dr. Wilson says it's normal this close to time." Jake's free hand hovered uncertainly near her rounded belly. "May I?" Sarah nodded, guiding his calloused palm to where the baby was most active. His eyes widened at the strong movement under. "His hand, strong little thing," he said with a hint of wonder. "Like its father," Sarah said without thinking, then felt the moment turn fragile as glass. They both knew she meant Thomas, but something in Jake's expression made her wonder if perhaps there was room in this child's life for two fathers, one in memory, one in daily presence. Later that night, Sarah found a cradle in the barn, half hidden under old saddle blankets. Jake was working on it in secret, she realized, smoothing rough wood in his spare moments. The discovery made her eyes burn with unexpected tears. The next morning she added extra blueberries to his breakfast pancakes, his favorite, she'd learned. He pretended not to notice, but his smile reached his eyes for the first time since their wedding. They were learning each other's rhythms, adapting to shared spaces and silent signals. Jake discovered that Sarah hummed when she was content, old. Hymns and folk songs barely audible above her work. Sarah learned that Jake's shoulders carried his worries and that a cup of hot coffee and quiet company could ease the tension better than words. Small kindnesses began to accumulate like spring, rain filling a dry creek bed. Jake brought in extra firewood without being asked, knowing Sarah felt the cold more these days. Sarah mended his shirts, noting how he touched the careful stitches with something like reverence. One evening, she found him studying his father's pocket watch, his face troubled in the lamplight. "The bank?" she asked softly, knowing his concerns about the mortgage. "We'll manage," he said, but didn't put the watch away. Sarah sat beside him, their shoulders just touching. "Tell me about him," she ventured. "Your father." Jake was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly he began to speak, sharing memories of the man who'd taught him everything he knew about ranching and life. Sarah listened, understanding that this wasn't just a story. It was a gift of trust. They weren't in love. Not yet. But they were learning to dance together, finding the steps to a partnership neither had expected, but both were beginning to value more with each passing day. The seed catalogue lay open on the kitchen table between them, its pages worn from frequent handling. Sarah ran her finger down the columns of vegetables and grain prices while Jake made calculations in his ledger. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the gold of their wedding bands, a sight that no longer startled them, as it had in those first days. "If we plant the north field in wheat," Sarah suggested, "and use the kitchen garden for vegetables we can preserve." She paused, realizing she'd said "we" without thinking. But Jake just nodded, adding figures to his neat columns. "Makes sense," he agreed, "though that north field's been fallow 2 seasons. Soil needs work." Sarah studied the concern lined in his face. The banknote was never far from their minds, but neither spoke of it directly anymore. It was their shared burden now, as much a part of their marriage as the rings they wore. "I can help," she offered. "I'm not completely useless yet." She patted her advanced belly with a rueful smile. Jake looked up sharply. "You shouldn't be, Jake McCall. If you tell me I shouldn't be working in my condition, I'll remind you that farm women have been having babies since time began. I know my limits." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am." They started early the next morning, Jake working the plow while Sarah followed, breaking up clods of earth with a hoe. The spring air was cool, heavy with the promise of rain. Sarah had tied one of Jake's old shirts over her dress to protect it, the fabric still holding traces of his scent, leather and hay, and something uniquely him that she'd grown accustomed to without realizing it. Jake kept glancing back at her, not hovering exactly, but watchful. Sarah pretended not to notice, though something warm unfurled in her chest at his concern. They worked in comfortable silence, broken only by the creak of leather harness and the soft encouragement Jake gave his horses. By mid-morning, dark clouds were gathering. Sarah straightened, pressing one hand to her aching back. Jake was beside her instantly, taking the hoe from her hands. "Time to head in," he said, no room for argument in his tone. "Storm's coming." Thunder rumbled in the distance as they walked back to the house, their shoulders brushing occasionally. A few fat raindrops began to fall just as they reached the porch. Jake helped her up the steps, his hand lingering at her elbow a moment longer than necessary. "I'll make coffee," Sarah said, but Jake shook his head. "You rest, I can manage coffee." She smiled at that. His first attempts at coffee had been memorable disasters, but he'd learned, just as she'd learned to harness the workhorses when his injured shoulder acted up, though he never said how he'd hurt it. The rain fell in earnest now, drumming on the roof as they sat at the kitchen table. Jake poured coffee while Sarah cut thick slices of bread she'd baked yesterday. The domesticity of the moment struck her suddenly. How natural it felt, sharing this quiet time with him. "Found something in town yesterday," Jake said, reaching into his vest pocket. He pulled out a packet of carrot seeds. "Remember you mentioned wanting them for the kitchen garden?" Sarah touched the packet gently. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it showed he'd listened, remembered, cared enough to think of her needs. "Thank you." Their fingers brushed as she took the seeds, and neither pulled away immediately. Lightning flashed outside, followed by booming thunder that made the windows rattle. The baby kicked vigorously in response. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed Jake's hand and pressed it to her belly. "Feel that? Someone doesn't like thunder." Jake's palm was warm through the fabric of her dress. The baby kicked again, and she felt, rather than saw, his quick intake of breath. Their eyes met, something electric passing between them that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Then Jake cleared his throat and withdrew his hand, though not hastily. "Storm might last a while. Good day for planning the rest of the planting." Sarah nodded, gathering up the scattered seed catalogue pages. They bent their heads over the kitchen table again, discussing crop rotations and harvest times, but something had shifted. Like the seeds they would plant, a tender possibility had taken root between them. As they worked, their hands would occasionally brush over the catalogue pages, and neither pulled away too quickly. Outside, the spring rain fell steady and nurturing on the freshly turned earth, promising growth for everything planted in its season. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by Frank Miller's boy who'd picked up the mail in town. Sarah recognized her sister Mary's handwriting immediately, but something about the envelope made her pause. It was torn and water-stained, marked with multiple forwarding addresses. This letter had been chasing her across the country. She sat heavily in Jake's father's old armchair, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal. The baby stirred restlessly as she read, as if sensing her growing distress. "My dearest Sarah," Mary wrote, "I pray this reaches you before you complete your journey. Thomas's brother William appeared at our door last week. He carried devastating news that changes everything." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. William had discovered evidence that the mine collapse hadn't been an accident. The company had known about the unsafe conditions, had covered up previous incidents. They were offering settlements to the widows, substantial settlements, but only if they could locate them before the government investigation began. "There's a trust fund," Mary explained, "for you and the baby, enough to buy a small farm outright, to secure your future. But you must come to California immediately to sign the papers. If you don't arrive before the investigation goes public, the company's lawyers say the offer will be withdrawn." Sarah pressed one hand to her mouth, the other cradling her belly. A chance at true security, at independence, everything she dreamed. of when she'd first set out west, but now the sound of boots on the porch made her quickly fold the letter. Jake entered, carrying the cradle he'd been working on in secret. The sight of it, nearly finished now, lovingly smoothed and polished, made her heart twist painfully. "Thought it was time to bring it in," he said, setting it carefully by the fire. "Dr. Wilson says it won't be long now." He paused, noticing her expression. "Sarah, what's wrong?" She couldn't lie to him, not after everything. Wordlessly, she held out the letter. Jake read it slowly, his face unreadable. When he finished, he folded it carefully before handing it back. "When will you leave?" "I'm not," she began, but he cut her off gently. "This is what you wanted, what you planned before." He gestured vaguely, encompassing their unusual circumstances. "It's a chance at a real future for you and the baby." "We have a future here," she said softly. Jake turned to the window, his shoulders tense. "A struggling ranch with a mortgage we can barely pay? A marriage of convenience with a man you barely... No, that's not the future you deserve, Sarah. That's not fair." She struggled to rise from the chair, and Jake was there instantly, helping her up despite his words. The baby kicked hard, and without thinking, she pressed his hand to her belly, holding it there. "Feel that? This child already knows your voice, your touch. You're not just convenient." Their eyes met, and something raw and honest passed between them. Jake's hand trembled slightly against her belly as the baby kicked again. "I never intended," he started, his voice rough. "When I agreed to this marriage, I thought I could keep my distance, be a provider, a protector, nothing more. But Sarah..." He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "But what?" she whispered. Instead of answering, he kissed her. Not the chaste, formal kiss they'd never shared at their wedding, but something real and tender and frightening in its intensity. Sarah found herself responding, her fingers curling into his shirt, drawing him closer. When they finally parted, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling in love with you," he confessed quietly, "with both of you, and I have no right to ask you to stay, no right to stand in the way of your security. But I had to tell you, had to let you know that for me, this stopped being convenient." Weeks ago, Sarah felt tears spill down her cheeks. The baby kicked again, as if emphasizing the complexity of their situation. Here was her chance at the independent future she'd dreamed of, the security she'd traveled so far to find. But here also was this man, this unexpectedly dear man, offering something she'd never thought to find again: love, freely given, and asking nothing in return. "Jake," she began, but a sharp pain lanced through her belly, stealing her breath. His arms tightened around her as she gasped. "Sarah?" Another pain gripped her, and she clutched his shirt. I think the baby has decided to complicate things even further." Jake's eyes widened with understanding and fear. The baby, it seemed, had chosen this moment to announce its imminent arrival, adding yet another layer to their already impossible decision. Thunder rolled across the valley as Jake helped Sarah to the bedroom, his childhood rain poncho still hanging forgotten by the door. Another contraction gripped her, and she clutched his arm, her breath coming in short gasps. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Dr. Wilson said first babies take their time." Sarah managed a weak smile. "Voice of experience, are you?" "I've delivered my share of calves." He helped her sit on the bed, then knelt to remove her shoes. The tender gesture brought fresh tears to her eyes, though whether from pain or emotion she couldn't say. "Jake, about what you said, about falling in love." "Shh." He squeezed her hand gently. "That's not important right now. Let me get Frank's boy to fetch the doctor." But as he stood to leave, Sarah held tight to his hand. "It is important, because I..." Another contraction cut off her words, stronger than the last. When it passed, she drew a shaky breath. "Because I think I'm falling in love with you, too." The cut admission hung in the air between them, as powerful as the storm building outside. Jake's face softened, and he brushed a strand of hair from her damp forehead. "You don't have to. I'm not saying it because of the baby, or the settlement, or anything else. Sarah met his eyes steadily. "I'm saying it because it's true, and whatever happens next, I needed you to know that." Lightning flickered at the windows, followed by a crash of thunder that rattled the glass. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out his father's watch, pressing it into her hands. "Hold on to this. I'll be right back." Sarah clutched the watch as another contraction built, its familiar weight somehow comforting. Through the pain, she could hear Jake's voice outside, shouting instructions to Frank's boy over the rising wind. The hands of the watch showed 4:15, the time everything changed. She thought of Mary's letter, now lying forgotten on the parlor table. The promise of security it offered seemed somehow less important than it had an hour ago. Here, in this moment, her world had narrowed to the rhythm of her body's demands, and the sound of Jake's boots on the porch. Returning to her, he came back with Ellen Wilson's old rain poncho and a determined expression. "Storm's getting worse. Frank's boy won't make it to town and back before dark." He helped her into the poncho, his movements gentle but efficient. "I'm taking you to the doctor myself." "Jake, no, it's too dangerous." More dangerous than trying to birth this baby alone? He was already gathering blankets, his jaw set in that stubborn way she'd come to know so well. "I've seen what mountain storms can do. We're going." Another contraction gripped her, and she bit back a cry. When it passed, she found Jake watching her with a mixture of concern and something deeper, something that made her heart flutter despite the pain. "I know you have a choice to make," he said quietly, helping her to her feet. "About California, about the settlement. But right now, let me take care of you. Both of you." The baby kicked vigorously as if in agreement, and Sarah pressed Jake's hand to her belly one more time. "We trust you," she whispered. His eyes glistened suspiciously as he helped her toward the door. Outside, the storm had turned the afternoon dark as twilight. Rain lashed against them as Jake half carried her to the wagon, which he'd padded with every blanket they owned. As he helped her up, Sarah caught sight of Mary's letter, blown against the porch railing by the wind. Let it go, she thought. Some things were worth more than money, worth more than carefully laid plans. Jake climbed up beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as he took the reins. The horses fought against the wind, but they trusted his guidance, just as Sarah did. Another contraction built, and she turned her face into his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent. "I've got you," he murmured, holding her close as they started down the muddy road. "I've got you both." The storm raged around them, but Sarah felt strangely peaceful. Whatever happened next, whether they made it to town, whether she took the settlement, whether their newfound love could weather all the challenges ahead, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating Jake's profile as he guided the horses through the storm. In her pocket, his father's watch ticked steadily on, marking each precious moment of their journey together. Cedar Ridge's annual spring fair had drawn most of the town to the main square despite the threatening weather. Eugenia Whitaker was just pinning a blue ribbon on her prize-winning strawberry preserves when Jake's wagon came thundering down the muddy street. Sarah huddled against his chest in the downpour. "Dr. Wilson!" Jake's voice carried over the wind. "Sarah's having the baby." The crowd parted like water as Dr. Wilson rushed forward, his wife Eleanor already gathering her skirts to follow. Even Eugenia dropped her ribbon, her face softening at the sight of Sarah's pain. "Get her to my office," Wilson ordered, but Sarah cried out as another contraction hit. "No time," Jake said, his arm tight around her. "Been coming steady, less than 5 minutes apart." "The church," Eleanor suggested quickly. "It's closer and dry." Without waiting for permission, Jake lifted Sarah into his arms. The watching townspeople murmured in surprise. Not at his actions, but at the tender way Sarah turned her face into his neck, the gentle kiss he pressed to her forehead. This was not the awkward arrangement they'd witnessed at the wedding. This was something else entirely. Inside the church, the Ladies' Aid Society's spring fair displays created an oddly festive atmosphere. Quilts hung from the pews, preserves lined the windowsills, and the scent of fresh-baked pies filled the air. Eleanor quickly cleared the church kitchen table while her husband gathered his medical bag. "Settled now?" Jake asked softly as he laid Sarah down. She nodded, gripping his hand as another contraction built. "Don't leave," she whispered. "Never," he promised, loud enough for everyone to hear. The watching women exchanged knowing looks. Love had a way of announcing itself, even in the midst of crisis. Martha Miller appeared with clean linens and hot water, her earlier judgment forgotten in the face of Sarah's need. "My Thomas was born right quick," she told Sarah encouragingly. "Sometimes the Lord knows we need things to happen in their own proper time." Thunder crashed outside as Dr. Wilson examined Sarah. "Baby's in a hurry," he confirmed. "Jake, you'll need to help hold her up." Jake moved behind Sarah without hesitation, supporting her against his chest. She leaned into his strength, their fingers interlaced as another contraction peaked. "You're doing so well, love," he murmured against her hair, no longer caring who heard the endearment. Through the pain and pressure, Sarah was acutely aware of the changes in the room. The women who had once whispered behind their hands now worked, together seamlessly, supporting her and Jake as if they'd always meant to. Even Eugenia Whittaker stood guard at the door, turning away curious onlookers with surprising fierceness. "Almost there," Dr. Wilson encouraged. "One more good push." Sarah gathered her strength, drawing on Jake's solid presence behind her. In that moment, all the complications fell away. The settlement offer, the bank note, the town's expectations. There was only this: Jake's heartbeat against her back, his whispered words of love and encouragement, and the overwhelming need to bring their child into the world. Their child. The thought struck her with sudden clarity. Somewhere between that stormy rescue and this moment, the baby had become theirs, not just hers. Jake's careful preparation of the cradle, his protective touches, his genuine love for a child not his own by blood, it all crystallized into perfect understanding. With a final mighty effort, Sarah pushed. The world suspended for one eternal moment, then filled with the lusty cry of new life. "A girl," Dr. Wilson announced, his voice thick with emotion. "Strong and perfect." Eleanor quickly wrapped the baby in one of the fair's display quilts. Martha, Miller's best work, though she didn't seem to mind its repurposing. The infant's angry cries softened as she was placed in Sarah's arms. "Look what we did," Sarah whispered, tilting her head back to see Jake's face. His eyes shone with tears as he touched their daughter's tiny hand with reverent fingers. "She's beautiful," he breathed, "just like her mama." The baby chose that moment to grab his finger with surprising strength. Jake's laugh was shaky with joy and wonder. Outside, the storm was passing. Sunlight broke through the church's stained glass windows, painting them all in jeweled colors. The Ladies' Aid Society fair ribbons fluttered in the fresh breeze, now coming through the open door, and someone had placed a bright blue one beside Sarah's pillow. First prize, it proclaimed, though for what, no one could quite say. "Well," Eugenia Whittaker announced to the waiting crowd outside, her voice carrying clear through the spring air, "it seems the good Lord knows what he's about after all. And if anyone has anything to say against the McCalls now, they'll answer to me." 2 weeks after little Grace's dramatic arrival, Sarah woke in the night to a sharp, familiar pain. Jake was instantly alert beside her. He'd taken to sleeping, in a chair next to their bed, insisting Sarah take the comfortable mattress during her recovery. "Sarah?" His voice was thick with sleep but already moving toward her. "What's wrong?" "Something's not right," she gasped, pressing a hand to her abdomen. The pain was different from birth, but no less frightening. "Could you fetch the medical?" "Get." Jake struck a match, lighting the bedside lamp. In its glow, Sarah could see the worry etched on his face. Dr. Wilson had left them with an emergency medical kit, warning that post-birth complications weren't uncommon. Jake retrieved it from the dresser with hands that trembled slightly. In her cradle by the bed, Grace stirred but didn't wake. "Sarah." watched Jake check their daughter with a gentle touch before turning his attention back to her. The tenderness of the gesture made her heart ache, even through her pain. "Should I ride for the doctor?" He perched on the edge of the bed, one warm hand covering hers where it pressed against the pain. "Not yet. Let's wait and see." Another cramp seized her, and she clutched his fingers. When it passed, she saw real fear in his eyes. "I can't lose you," he said quietly. "Either of you. I never thought I'd have this kind of happiness again, and now—" "Jake McCall." Sarah managed a weak smile. "Are you admitting that our marriage of convenience has become inconveniently important to you?" His laugh was shaky. "Reckon I am." He smoothed her hair back from her forehead, the touch lingering. "When I saw you holding Grace in that church, looking so beautiful and strong, I knew I'd been fooling myself, thinking I could keep my heart out of this." "Your heart's always been in it." Sarah shifted, trying to find a comfortable position. "From the moment you rode into that flood to save a stranger," Jake's hand stilled in her hair. "You're no stranger now." "No," she agreed softly. "I'm your wife, the mother of your daughter." His eyes met hers, full of emotion. "Say that again." "Your daughter," Sarah repeated firmly. "Because that's what she is, Jake. Not just mine. The way you love her, the way you've loved us both. Blood couldn't make you more her father than you already are." Grace chose that moment to wake, her tiny fingers curling and uncurling in the lamplight. Jake lifted her with practiced care, bringing her to Sarah's arms. The baby nuzzled close, and Sarah felt the cramping pain ease slightly. "Tell me about your mother," she said suddenly. "What would she have thought of all this?" Jake settled back, in his chair watching them with soft eyes. "She would have loved you, both of you. Ma always said the best things in life come unexpected." He smiled. "Like the spring rain that saves a failing crop, or the stray cat that turns out to be the best mouser on the ranch, or the flood that brings a family together," Sarah suggested. "Exactly that." He reached out to touch Grace's downy head. "Ma was wise that way, knew that love doesn't always come the way you plan it." They talked through the night, sharing stories and watches over Grace as Sarah's pain gradually subsided. By dawn, Dr. Wilson had confirmed it was just normal post-birth complications, nothing serious, but something had shifted during those quiet hours of worry and confession. Jake moved his things into their room properly that morning, his few possessions fitting naturally among Sarah's, as if they'd always belonged there. His father's pocket watch found a home on the bedside table, ticking steadily beside the medical kit they hopefully wouldn't need again. Later, as Sarah watched Jake walk the floor with a fussy grace, humming off-key but with such patience and love, she thought about Mary's letter. The settlement money was still there, still a possibility. But as Jake turned to smile at her, their daughter finally drifting to sleep against his shoulder, Sarah knew some forms of security couldn't be measured in dollars. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Sarah patted the bed beside her, and he sat carefully, keeping Grace snug against him. "I'm thinking that sometimes the best choice isn't the most practical one." She leaned against his arm, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "And that love might not pay the mortgage, but it makes a house a home." Jake's free arm curled around her, drawing her closer. "Speaking of practical matters," he said hesitantly, "Frank Miller mentioned his boy might be interested in leasing our north pasture. With the spring rains, the grazing's good this year." "Our north pasture," Sarah repeated, loving how natural the words felt. "See, God provides, just not always in the ways we expect." Grace sighed in her sleep, one tiny hand clutching Jake's shirt. Outside, the morning sun painted their room in shades of promise, a new day dawning on the family they'd built from circumstance and choice, and, most unexpectedly, love. The first harvest account book of their marriage told a story in numbers and careful notations. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, Grace sleeping in a sling across her chest as she reviewed their progress. Jake's neat figures marched down the page. Wheat yields from the north field, income from Miller's boys' grazing lease, Preserves sold at the general store. It's not quite enough for the full mortgage payment, she calculated, but it's closer than we've been. Jake paused in cleaning his father's old rifle, his expression thoughtful. Frank says there's talk of the railroad buying land for a new spur line. If they choose the valley route, our south pasture would be prime location for a depot. Sarah touched the ledger reverently. Your father would be proud, Jake. You're not just keeping the ranch alive, you're helping it grow. He set the rifle aside and came to stand behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder while the other gently stroked Grace's dark curls. We're helping it grow. Your vegetable preserves brought in more than my last cattle sale. Sarah leaned back against him, remembering the day Martha Miller had suggested selling her extra preserves. The same women who'd once whispered behind their hands now sought out Mrs. McCall's pickled beans and Sarah's apple butter. Speaking of cattle, Jake continued, Whitaker's offering fair price for our fall calves, better than the auction would bring. Sarah smiled at the irony. Eugenia's husband had become one of their strongest supporters ever since the day his wife had declared the McCalls under her protection. The town's acceptance had come gradually but completely, like spring snow melting into fertile soil. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Frank Miller's boy, Timothy, stood on the porch, hat in hand. Mr. McCall, Pa sent me to ask if you might help with our hay cutting. Our new mower's giving trouble and you've always had a way with machinery. Jake glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. Go on, I'll finish the accounts. She watched through the window as Jake walked to the barn with Timothy, explaining something about gears and timing. The young man listened intently, reminding her of how Jake must have looked learning from his own father years ago. Grace stirred, rooting hungrily, and Sarah settled in the rocking chair to nurse her. These quiet moments were precious, allowing her to reflect on how far they'd come. The house felt different now, warmer, lived in, filled with the mingled scents of baby powder, fresh bread, and Jake's coffee. Their bed no longer felt too large or awkward, but just right for the three of them when Grace needed comfort in the night. Jake's clothes hung beside hers in the wardrobe. His razor shared space with her hairbrush, and their wedding rings had worn matching grooves in their fingers. The afternoon brought the rhythmic sound of the haymower from Miller's property, accompanied by men's voices calling instructions and jokes. Sarah worked on her accounts, adding a new column for future railway possibilities. Grace played on a quilt nearby, batting at the wooden rings Jake had carved for her. When Jake returned at dusk, his shirt damp with honest work, he brought news. Miller's offering us first cut of his east field. Says his herd won't need it all, and he'd rather sell to neighbors than strangers. Sarah set aside her ledger. That would see our stock through winter, with plenty left to sell come spring. Aye. Jake scooped up Grace, who gurgled happily at her father, and Timothy's asked to learn more about ranch work, thinks he might want to lease more of our land next season. The Lord does provide, Sarah murmured, remembering Martha Miller's words. From Grace's birth, just not always in ways we expect. Jake settled Grace on his hip, his free hand reaching for Sarah's. Speaking of unexpected blessings, he pulled her close, his kiss tender but thorough. Grace patted their faces, demanding attention, making them both laugh. I never thought I'd have this again, Jake admitted quietly. A family, a future. When Pa died and Ma left, I thought I was meant to be alone. Sarah touched his cheek, rough with evening stubble. And I thought I was meant to be independent, not to need anyone. Funny how life has other plans. Later, after Grace was asleep and the evening chores done, they sat on the porch, watching summer stars emerge. The first cut of hay lay drying in Miller's field, its sweet scent carried on the cooling air. From the barn came the comfortable sounds of settling livestock, their small herd, growing slowly but steadily under their joint care. Jake's arm was warm around her shoulders as Sarah nursed Grace one last time before bed. The baby's eyes were Heavy with sleep, one tiny hand curled around her father's finger. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valley, a sound that now carried hope instead of longing. Our first harvest together, Sarah mused, watching the moon rise over their strengthening ranch, and many more to come. Jake's kiss touched her hair, a gesture as natural as breathing. Many more, he agreed, his voice rich with contentment. Many more. The box of Thomas's letters sat untouched in Sarah's dresser drawer for weeks after she'd found them while organizing the bedroom. Now, as Grace napped and Jake was out mending fences, she finally found the courage to open it. The U. Familiar handwriting brought a bittersweet ache to her heart, but not the sharp pain she'd expected. "My dearest Sarah," the top letter read, "when you read this, I'll be gone. There are things you need to know." Her hands trembled as she read Thomas's final letter, written the day before the mine collapse. He'd known about the unsafe conditions, had been gathering evidence to report the company, but more than that, he'd known the risks he was taking. "If anything happens to me," he'd written, "don't let grief steal your future. You have so much love to give, Sarah. Promise me you'll find happiness again, even if it's not the happiness we planned." A floorboard creaked, and Sarah looked up to find Jake in the doorway, his expression concerned. "Found these while fixing the drawer," she explained softly, holding up the letters. Jake started to step back. "I'll give you privacy." "No," Sarah held out her hand. "Stay, please." He crossed to sit beside her on the bed, close enough to support but not so close as to intrude. His quiet strength, as always, exactly what she needed. "Thomas knew," she said, showing him the letter. "About the mine, about everything. That's why they're offering the settlement. Not from guilt, but to keep other widows from finding these letters." Jake read silently, his jaw tightening at the evidence of corporate negligence. When he finished, he carefully folded the letter. He was a good man, yes. Sarah touched the paper gently. "He wanted me to be happy, to find love again." She looked up at Jake, her heart full. "I don't think he could have hoped for a better father for his child." "Sarah," Jake's voice was rough with emotion. "I've made my decision," she continued, "about the settlement money." The tension in Jake's shoulders told her he'd been dreading this moment. "When do you leave?" "I'm not going to California." His head snapped up. "But the money, the security." "I have security right here." Sarah took his hand, placing it over her heart. "You, Grace, the ranch. This is the happiness Thomas wanted for me. The happiness I want for myself." "It won't be easy," Jake warned, though hope blazed in his eyes. "The mortgage will manage. The railway's coming, Miller's boy wants to expand his lease, and my preserves are selling better every week." She smiled. "Besides, I had a letter from Mary yesterday. She's learned that other widows have already gone public with their evidence. The company's facing investigations whether I come forward or not." Jake drew her into his arms, his embrace fierce and protective. "You're sure? Really sure?" "I've never been more certain of anything." Sarah breathed in his familiar scent, leather and hay and home. "That flood didn't just save my life, Jake. It brought me where I was always meant to be." Grace's cry from the cradle interrupted them. Jake rose to get her, his movements sure and natural as he lifted their daughter. Sarah watched them together, Jake's strong hands gentle with Grace's tiny form, her perfect trust in her father's care, and knew she'd made the right choice. "I found something else today," she said, reaching into the box. "Thomas's wedding ring, the one I gave you to wear at our wedding. I thought maybe we could put it away, get you a new one, start fresh." Jake shifted Grace to one arm, his other, hand touching the gold band he'd worn these past months. "Only if you're ready." "I am." Sarah stood, crossing to them. "Thomas will always be Grace's birth father, will always have a place in our hearts. But you're my husband now, my real husband, not just on paper, and Grace's real father in all the ways that matter." Jake's kiss was tender, mindful of Grace between them. When they parted, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I love you, Sarah McCall. You and this little one are everything I never knew I needed." And you're everything I wasn't looking for, but found anyway. Sarah touched his cheek. Sometimes the best gifts come in unexpected packages, Grace gurgled, patting Jake's face with tiny fingers, making them both laugh. Outside, the sound of approaching hooves announced Frank Miller's arrival to discuss the railway plans, their comfortable routine, their shared life, their growing success. All of it felt right in a way that money alone never could. Sarah gathered the letters, knowing she'd keep them for Grace to read someday. But Thomas's final words weren't about the past anymore. They were permission to embrace this future, this love, this family that had bloomed from the seeds of tragedy and chance. The railway survey crew arrived on the hottest day of summer, their presence drawing most of Cedar Ridge to the south pasture. Jake stood with Sarah and Grace, watching as the surveyors took their measurements, each stake they drove into the ground representing another step toward their future. Depot would go there. Frank Miller pointed toward the flat stretch near the creek. Loading pens beside it, fair price for the land, Jake, and first rights to ship cattle at preferred rates. Sarah squeezed Jake's hand, feeling his tension. This was his father's land they were talking about selling, but it was also their daughter's future they were securing. Pa always said, Jake began, but a commotion from the creek interrupted. The dam's breaking! Timothy Miller's shout carried across the pasture. Flash flood coming down from the mountains! Jake was moving before the words fully registered, his ranch training taking over. Get everyone to high ground, he ordered, already running toward the livestock pens. Sarah, take Grace to the house. But Sarah had seen what he hadn't. Two of the survey crew's horses still tied near the creek. The horses, she called, passing Grace to Martha Miller. Before anyone could stop her, she was running toward the panicking animals. Sarah, no! Jake's voice carried over the growing roar of water. She reached the first horse as the dam broke upstream, the sound like thunder. Her fingers fumbled with the wet knot as water began swirling around her ankles. The second horse reared in terror, its reins tangled in a fence post. Suddenly Jake was beside her, his knife slicing through the ropes. Like old times, he managed, referring to their first meeting, though I recall you being the one needing rescue. Maybe it's my turn to rescue you, Sarah shot back, though fear made her voice shake. They worked in desperate tandem, freeing both horses as the water rose, but they'd waited too long. The flood hit with crushing force, cutting off their escape route to higher ground. Jake grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward an old oak tree. Climb! They scrambled up just as the full force of the flood reached them. Sarah clung to a branch, watching in horror as their carefully placed railway stakes disappeared under the churning water. The survey crew's equipment, the portable pens, even their hopes of easy prosperity, all swept away in nature's fury. The ranch, Sarah gasped, thinking of their home, their livestock, everything they'd built together. Frank will handle it, Jake assured her, though his voice was tight with worry. He knows what to do. They huddled together in the tree as the water raged below, each lost in memories of another flood that had brought them together. Sarah felt Jake's arms tighten around her as a massive log swept past, threatening their perch. I'm sorry, she whispered. If I hadn't gone for the horses— Hush! Jake's voice was fierce with emotion. That compassion, that courage, it's why I fell in love with you. Besides, his attempt at a smile was wan but real. Seems like floods are our destiny. Hours passed. The water gradually receded, leaving behind a changed landscape. Their south pasture was torn up, the carefully surveyed railway route now a mess of mud and debris. But in the distance, they could see figures moving on their ranch, people working together, saving what could be saved. Look, Jake pointed as riders approached their tree. Cedar Ridge's finest rescue party. Frank Miller led the group, looking relieved to find them alive. Town's turned out in force, he called up. Your cattle are safe in my north pasture. Martha's got Grace, sound asleep in your house. Water never reached that high. And everyone's pitching in to clean up. As they climbed down to their rescuers, Sarah saw the truth of it. The whole town was there, working to restore their land. Eugenia Whitaker was organizing women with food and coffee. The survey crew had joined the bucket line clearing debris. Even Edwin Porter from the bank was rolling up his sleeves to help. "Railway company won't like this delay," Jake said quietly as they rode back to the ranch. "Maybe not," Frank agreed, "but they'll like the new route better. Higher ground, better drainage. Thompson from the survey crew's already redrawing the plans. Says this flood might have saved them future trouble." Sarah felt Jake relax slightly. Beside her, "Everything happens for a reason," she murmured. "Indeed it does, Mrs. McCall," Eugenia called from where she was directing cleanup efforts. "Indeed it does. Now come get some coffee and tell us how you two managed to turn another flood into a romance." Later, as the sun set on their muddy but salvageable pasture, Sarah and Jake stood on their porch, Grace sleeping peacefully in her father's arms. Their land was scarred but not broken, their future delayed but not destroyed, and their love, tested by nature itself, had proven stronger than any flood. "You know," Jake said thoughtfully, "Pa used to say the best ranch land was the kind that could take nature's worst and come back stronger." Sarah leaned against him, watching their friends and neighbors working together in the fading light. He must have been talking about the people too. The town photographer arrived on a crisp autumn morning, his camera and tripod carried carefully across the freshly gravelled path, the railway company's first improvement to the property. Sarah smoothed Grace's best dress while Jake straightened his string tie, both of them nervous about capturing this moment. "First McCall family portrait," the photographer announced, positioning them on the porch. "Though I hear it won't be the last." He winked at Sarah, who blushed, her hand unconsciously touching her still flat stomach. They hadn't announced the news yet, but Cedar Ridge had its ways of knowing things. Jake's arm settled warm around her. Waist as they posed, Grace balanced between them. The baby reached for her father's watch chain, a familiar gesture that made them both smile naturally, just as the photographer clicked his shutter. "Perfect," he declared. "A real family." The words struck Sarah deeply. She remembered another portrait, taken years ago with Thomas, both of them young and full of dreams. That photograph had been packed away now, not forgotten, but properly placed. In the past, this moment, with Jake's solid presence beside her and Grace's sweet baby scent, and the future quickening beneath her heart, this was her present, a happiness. Later, as they walked the recovering south pasture, Jake pointed out the railway's new survey stakes, planted on higher, safer ground. "They're offering more now," he said. "Say this route's actually better for them. Something about great percentages and loading efficiency." "Your father would be proud," Sarah said softly, "not just of saving the ranch, but of how you've helped it grow, how you've built a legacy for Grace." And she took his hand, placing it low on her belly. Jake's eyes widened. "Sarah, are you sure?" She nodded, happy tears threatening. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday. Seems God has plans for filling this house with love." Jake pulled her close, mindful of Grace dozing in her sling. His kiss tasted of joy and morning coffee and forever. When they parted, he touched her face with wondering fingers. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted. "After Ma left, I figured some people just weren't meant for family life, and I thought I'd had my one chance at love." Sarah leaned into his touch. "Seems we were both wrong." Grace stirred, patting Jake's chest with tiny hands. He lifted her up, her delighted giggle carrying across the autumn gold pasture. Sarah watched them together, this man who had become husband and partner in all ways, and felt complete. Railroad would come, bringing progress and prosperity. Their family would grow, filling the old ranch house with new life and laughter. But more than that, they had built something rare and precious, a love that had transformed from necessity to choice, from arrangement to destiny. "Come on," Jake said, offering his arm. "Let's go home." Sarah took it, falling into step beside him. Home, not just a place, but a feeling. Not just a marriage, but a union of hearts. Not just a family, but a miracle born of floodwaters and faith and the courage to love again. Spring came again to Cedar Ridge, painting the valley in wildflowers and promise. Sarah stood on the porch of the newly painted ranch house watching. Jake approached from the railway depot. their second child growing strong beneath her heart. Grace toddled beside her father, one tiny hand trustingly in his as they stopped to examine each flower along the path. The past year had transformed the McCall ranch almost beyond recognition. The railway spur brought regular income, their expanded herd thrived, and Sarah's preserves had become a regional favorite. But the greatest change was in the little family that had grown from necessity into joy. They paused at the spot where Miller's Creek had once nearly claimed Sarah's life. Jake lifted Grace onto his shoulders, then drew Sarah close for a kiss that tasted of belonging. Their new wedding rings caught the spring sunlight, chosen together, worn with pride and purpose. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. McCall," Jake murmured. Against her hair, Sarah smiled, remembering that long-ago storm that had brought her home. "Happy anniversary, my love."